And Joe Biden, the US president, has said that Putin, in his words, cannot remain in power. I mean, no matter how horrific, the war crimes that Russia has been committing, is it right for the US president to be effectively calling for regime change?
Well, the United States and the United Kingdom and our NATO allies have been clear what we think about the action that Russia has taken in Ukraine. The Labour Party entirely supports the work that we're doing internationally in the NATO alliance. We support what the United States is doing. This is why we want to go as far as we possibly can on sanctions on Russia. I'll leave the comments that the President of the United States has made for the White House to clarify. I think they put out comments about that. But we have to do all we can to impose the maximum pressure on Russia through sanctions. We've obviously pushed the government to go further and faster, but we also need to do what we can to support the Ukraine with what assistance and to listen carefully to what Ukraine are calling for in terms of assistance. And we need to ensure that there's humanitarian support as well, particularly around refugees. And it's great that that the British people have shown such generosity in signing up to the refugee programme, but we still have too much bureaucracy in place, and we need to do all we can to take the refugees that we obviously ought to take.
OK, you talked there about the need to kind of step up assistance, to do all we can. But I think it's important to get into specifics, isn't it? Because the easy bit is saying that we need to do everything we can. We need to look at what Ukraine is asking for. President Zelensky has called on European countries to do more, hasn't he? So what specifically do you think the UK can actually do, in your view?
Well, we've obviously already offered equipment. We need to. Our defence experts will want to consider carefully other requests for equipment and make a judgment about what is appropriate. We in the Labour Party have supported the government on that, and will continue to support the government in whatever decisions that they need to take in that respect. But we also need to do more on the humanitarian side as well. I mean, there is so much bureaucracy in place which is prohibiting the ability for British families to take in refugees, as they have been asked to do and have signed up and are wanting to do. So there's a number of things where we need to move further and faster. But there is no division between the Labour Party and the people of Ukraine, and the Labour Party and our commitment to NATO and our commitment to doing the right thing in this awful conflict.
OK. We just heard from the Education Secretary. There's lots going on domestically as well, with the cost of living emergency, effectively, rather than a crisis that is hitting the United Kingdom. Firstly, just to clear something up, when Rishi Sunak gave his spring statement, and after he'd finished unveiling that support, there was a kind of a loud voice from the Labour benches shouting, "Is that it?" Was that you?
Yes, it was me. And the reason that was me is because I thought Rishi Sunak, in what is an incredibly serious time, we just talked about Ukraine, failed to rise to the moment, failed to deliver for the British people. Look, as a consequence of the decisions that Rishi Sunak and his Conservative MPs have made, the state pension will be cut in real terms by the biggest amount for 50 years. The tax burden is going to be the highest since the 40s. The collapse in living standards, the most dramatic since the 50s. Later this week, the universal credit will be cut in real terms. Disability benefits will be cut in real terms. And that means over 1 million people pushed into poverty, many pensioners pushed into poverty, 500,000 children pushed into absolute poverty. And there'll be people watching the show this morning who are struggling with their bills, who can't fill up their car, whose cupboards are bare, whose fridges are empty, whose children are hungry, and Rishi Sunak thinks that's a price worth paying. Well, we in the Labour Party don't.
Is the problem, though, money, effectively? I don't think anyone would disagree about the concern that you have expressed there about how families aren't going to cope, in the months and years ahead. But, you want more money for pensioners, more money for the NHS after COVID. Keir Starmer's call for more defence spending, obviously more money to tackle the cost of living emergency through energy bills, through benefits. And I know that we'll start talking about the Chancellor's, windfall because of increased tax revenues, but things are, of course, very volatile as well. I mean, the cost of borrowing, for example, has quadrupled in the last year. Is it not important for the government to also maintain some fiscal discipline?
Well, Rishi Sunak obviously had more room for manoeuvre in this spring statement, in this mini-budget, but rather than acting in the interest of the British people, he was playing games. He was acting in his own interest because he thinks by offering an income tax cut in 2 years, that will help him politically with Conservative MPs if there's a leadership contest, or that will fit the Tory election grid. I don't believe that putting 1.3 million people into poverty, because you're imposing a very severe real terms cut to universal credit, you're imposing the biggest cut to the pension in 50 years, is fair. Government is about choices, and he could have taken a different set of choices. He could have imposed a windfall tax on those monumental profits the gas and oil companies have made, and used that windfall tax to help struggling families and pensioners with their energy bills. He chose not to do that. Instead, he's imposed these very punishing tax rises, these very severe real terms cuts to the pension and support like universal credit, and he's expecting people to be grateful because 2 years down the road, he's saying there's going to be an income tax cut, even though that income tax cut nowhere near offsets the 15 tax rises that he has imposed on the British people, £3,000 extra per household if you do a rough and ready calculation. He is a tax rising chancellor. He is Mr. Tax, and it's the British people who are paying the price.
Well, it's pretty clear that Rishi Sunak has seen his most difficult set of headlines this week. I think that goes without saying. Who would you prefer to face in an election, Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak?
You know something? I mean, I don't care that Rishi Sunak is facing difficult headlines. I'm more concerned about the difficult circumstances British pensioners are facing, the difficult circumstances that families, often in work, are facing with the cost of living. As I say, not able to afford their heating bills, cutting back on hot meals. That's what pensioners tell me, that they're not using their oven because they cannot afford the bills associated with heating their oven, or foregoing hot showers because they can't afford the bills associated with running hot water. That is what concerns me. That is what makes me angry, that for the biggest real terms cut in the pension for 50 years, and Rishi Sunak thinks that's a price worth paying. If he gets bad headlines as a consequence of that, quite rightly, because he is pushing people into poverty because he thinks by being clever that allows him to cut tax in a couple of years' time, income tax, ahead of a general election. That's not right. It's not a price worth paying.
OK, now let's just move on, because I'm quite keen to talk to you a little bit about COVID. You're obviously work and pensions brief at the minute, but you were Shadow Health Secretary throughout the pandemic. So just to put that hat back on briefly, COVID cases are rising. We're seeing around 1 in 16 people thought to have the virus. How worried should we be about that?
Well, I always said that living with COVID is not the same as ignoring COVID. But I also said that there'll come a point where, because of our advances in vaccination, because of our advances in antiviral medicines, that we'll be able to move away from the restrictions that sadly had to be in place 2 years ago. I think when you look at where the infection rates appear to be higher again, some of the cities like Birmingham and Leeds, their second dose rates on vaccinations are still in the sort of 70% region. So we've still got further to go on vaccination. It's not job done on vaccination. So I'd really encourage the government to put in place more support at a local level to drive up those vaccination rates. The second thing, of course, is I remember before we went into lockdown, I went into Downing Street to meet Boris Johnson and Chris Whitty and Dominic Cummings and others. I had separate meetings as well with Matt Hancock to discuss the upcoming legislation that would impose these very severe restrictions. We supported those restrictions in the national interest, but we also said that people would need economic support. And from those negotiations came an agreement that statutory sick pay would be paid from day one.
OK.
That day one statutory sick pay has now been stopped. Well, if people are getting ill, they will need sick pay from day one. So I would urge the government to reintroduce statutory sick pay from day one.
We have run out of time, but just to quickly ask you your thoughts after the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge's Caribbean tour. Prince William acknowledged growing Republican sentiment, saying it's brought into even sharper focus questions about the past and the future, and he's not about telling people what to do. Do you think this could be the end of the Commonwealth?
No, I don't think the Commonwealth will, and I think the Commonwealth will endure. But obviously individual nations will always make their own judgments and come to their own decisions about their membership of the Commonwealth. But I'm I'm absolutely convinced that the Commonwealth will survive and will endure, and that's for the good.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Jonathan Ashworth there from Labour.